Okay, guys. Today we're going to go over Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" and Bob Dylan's "Tangled Up in Blue." Dylan Thomas, he's a Welsh poet. He was born in 1914. He died in 1953 when he was 39. Um, Ultimately, he's considered to be one of the most well-recognized war poets. And when you refer to war poets, it has to do with largely World War One and World War Two. He was a direct product of World War One. His father being a soldier and not really functional that much after too much after the war, and then especially after World War Two, um, because essentially his father had fought in World War One to try and avoid World War Two from happening ever. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and obviously it wasn't. So when most people refer to the war poets, it's those that were soldiers during one of them, or direct products of. So he was born into basically the lost generation. Lost Generations, Hemingway, all of that. But he died when he was 39 years old. Finally, after the war had been won. And it mostly had to do with his father. He and his father had a complex and complicated relationship, is probably the best way to put it. He thought his father should be able to beat anything. However, his father was also rather a staunch, fortified man. Essentially, it was the embodiment of the British mentality of the stiff upper lip. Maintain the stiff upper lip. This is something that in some families it's still very much a thing, and in some regions it's still very much a thing. Ultimately, Dylan Thomas's father had died the year before. It was less than a year before Dylan Thomas's death. Uh, so his father died in 52 of what is still to this day believed to be complications from cancer. But Dylan Thomas spent most of his life struggling with issues like alcoholism and drug addiction. So when his father died, he just went head first back into that hole of drinking and drug addiction. He did die in New York, essentially from an overdose. His body just gave out. And that's all that was there. But he did write "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" as his father was fighting that last fight before he died. So let's dig into it, and we'll get into Bob Dylan and why they tied together. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of light. Okay, so this first stanza, 3 lines long. Each stanza, it's just 3 lines, but these first 3 lines are repeated. So, are repeated throughout the poem. So it's a crucial concept, and these are like these are lines that cannot be avoided. So you have Dylan Thomas saying, do not go gentle into that good night. The good night is death. The good night is the welcome embrace of death, especially after these 2 wars. That's why it's referred to as good night. Now, saying do not go gentle, that is another concept of fight death, or at least struggle against it. So then we have the second line, old age should burn and rave at close of day. Okay, so close of day, that's a common utility of a metaphor. As the sun is setting, that's like the twilight years of someone's life. When the sun finally goes down, that's the end of someone's life. It's essentially life cycle passing of the sun from dawn to dusk. But here, rave, you have to keep that word in mind because it has multiple meanings. Obviously today it's a type of party. That is not the same thing. But raving is usually something that's associated with insanity. But the other aspect of it is it's usually a high energy mania. So it's almost as though he's saying old age and people of old age should vehemently fight against death. Rage against the dying of the light. Okay. So obviously you're using the repetition of sound with rave and rage to reinforce the 2 of them, but rage isn't just a fighting back mania. Rage is be angry about it. Rage is be upset that your light is going out. And you can almost hear him begging. The wise men at their inn know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning. They do not go gentle to that good night. So here we have the first instance of type of person, wise men. Though wise men at their end know dark is right. Okay, so this is basically saying, even though wise men know that death is natural and it happens, and they're willing to accept it, because their words had forked no lightning. He essentially is saying, with lightning, it's that they aren't creating a constant fodder. If you utilize mythology, because their words had forked no lightning, being able to evoke an energy standard of lightning, or being able to evoke that kind of emotion in someone else, that is what makes these men wise. They know death is natural, and they are essentially not fighting against it. Or they know death is natural, and they're not trying to destroy how people proceed into that death. They do not go gentle into that good night. So he says, wise men who know that dying is inevitable, they don't go gentle into that good night, even wise men. So if you have even wise men fighting death, why? Why do even wise men fight death? It's the end. It's an unknown end. So even wise men who know they should and who know they do go into death. Every life goes into death. You basically have to imagine whether someone is willing to go, yes, take my breath, take my life. The answer is frequently going to be no. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So here you have good men. It's not that they're wise. It's another group. It's not that they're wise. It's not that they've necessarily lived long. Here, good men, it's people who have tried to do something with their life, or people who have dedicated themselves to something. The last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. So not only is there an image of like physical waving with your hand, but also the last wave of good men. They're actually discussing, and part of how they rage against death is by reiterating the things that they did in their life. And this here is specifically veterans of World War I and World War II. Basically, you have good men saying aloud, reiterating how bright their frail deeds. Okay, so reiterating how important what they did might have been or might have done. Why would you refer to anyone's actions, especially veterans' actions, as frail? Dylan Thomas, being a wartime poet, he essentially is proving that World War I did not prevent or end war for humanity. So it is in fact a frail deed, having fought in that war, creating that peace. It is very frail. But does that make it not necessary? World War II happened, essentially trying to put into perspective World War I as pointless. Or at least that's what's being reiterated here. Why did those many millions of people lose their lives in World War I if that many millions of people were going to die in World War II? Basically with the exact same lines drawn for each war. That's frailty. That's highlighting and showing the fact that peace is very, very tenuous. Now, saying their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Now, here, you can take it a couple of different ways, and it's actually probably intended to be taken a couple of different ways. A green bay isn't just the mark that it's not just an image. It's very specific. So just take the word bay. Obviously that has to do with water, but why would the water be green? If you have ever seen the Atlantic, it is frequently seen as more green than blue. But also, that keyword green instead of bay, that's fighting on a field. So utilizing the phrase green bay, it's highlighting those who fought on the land and from the sea. Their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So all of these men, these people who have fought and tried to change something that is fundamental in humanity, they ultimately decide that they too should fight for their lives. And then we have the line, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Using rage, rage for the first time by itself, it is highly appropriate when using it in conjunction with the good men who have fought. Essentially, it's saying fight death as well. Death is something that needs to be fought as well. Then the next line, or the next stanza, wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Okay. First off, the use of the phrase wild men, it's very important, especially with Dylan Thomas being a British author. Though he is Welsh, Wales is part of Britain. The end of the British Empire didn't fully come about until the end of World War II. At the end of World War I, everyone, like all of the empires were kind of falling and failing. But it all didn't happen or finalize until after World War II. So the phrase wild men, it's not unheard of and not unseen. Rather, it's utilizing some of that colonial rhetoric, some of that colonial writing. So the wild men essentially were the savages or the barbarians, or however you wanted to put it within the colonial rhetoric. But then it's wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight. Okay, so these wild men who caught the sun. Can you catch the sun? No, and thus far we've already established that the progression of the sun in this poem, it's what point in life you're at. So, wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight. So here we have people who not only had a different method of working and worshiping with the sun, however, they also had a different way of measuring, like as the sun went down, literally. And learn too late, they grieved it on its way. Okay, so wild men learned too late that they grieved the sun going down. The idea of teaching the barbarian or teaching the savage or teaching the wild man, that is something that was always present in the British Empire. But the thing is, if they learned too late that they grieved it on its way, does the education matter? Does it seem to matter at all? No. It still ends up with everyone at the same position, everyone dying. And not only everyone dying, but an inability to escape it. But that inability does not mean that you do not fight the good night. It doesn't mean you go easily. So wild men, much like wise men, they do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage against the dying of the light. So grave men. Grave here also has two different meanings. It both means very serious, but it can also mean on their deathbed. And then near death, so those who would be more prone to either fighting or allowing their death to occur. See with blinding sight. Okay, so blinding sight, that's not usually something... It's not usually something that is put together. Sight that is blinding somehow. Now, this is actually referring to a type of sight that goes beyond normal sight. It's the kind of sight that only those who are dying get. It's the type of insight into people and to functioning that only those who are soon to be out of this world get. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. So even those who are blind, even those who do not understand, can see and understand something. As they are essentially hurtling like meteors towards their death. And they rage. Now, before we go into the last stanza, I do want to highlight. We have wise men who do not go gentle. And we have wild men who do not go gentle. So this is something that is very interesting, especially at the fall of the British Empire. You have wise men and wild men described the same. If they're described the same, if they function in the same manner, then they are similar. So the centuries of rhetoric beforehand of saying that these wild men can't be intelligent or wise, as they all lay there on their deathbed, they're all the same. We're all the same. Good men and grave men are the same, and they rage against the dying of the light. So good men, people who have already fought, and people who are going to have one last fight. And grave men who can finally see the truth of not only life, but also death. They rage. So if you put good men and grave men, meaning very serious and or nearly dead, as raging is a struggle of a fight. So then we have the last stanza. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now, with your fierce tears I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So here he's saying his father is all of these and none of these. And when he says, there on sad height is the moment of death, the moment before death, and the moment of death. It's the idea of ascension. But Dylan Thomas says, curse, bless me, now with your fierce tears. He's saying, curse at me, bless me, which they're actually the same thing. Basically, he's saying, I don't care what you say or do to me. I just hope you fight. I just hope you go out fighting with this type of vehemence. And then he says, I pray. So he as the narrator is begging. He is literally praying to an omnipotent power to let his father curse, bless, whatever, but not to go out willingly. And then he says, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Okay. Now, just so that this makes a bit of sense as we lead into it, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, he was a huge fan of Dylan Thomas. His real name is Robert Zimmerman. He's still alive today. He still plays concerts. But he also he chose the last name Dylan from Dylan Thomas. So that's the degree of fandom we have here. Their lives do overlap. Dylan Thomas died when Bob Dylan was already alive. He's well into his 80s at this point. But many people have debated the validity of Bob Dylan as a poet. That debate entered into the global landscape a few years ago in 2017, when he not only was put up for the Nobel Prize in Literature, but also won it. That is not to say that the people he was nominated with didn't equally deserve it. They did. But there's something in his lyrics that enables those lyrics to reach beyond the actual song and the actual word and create whatever tone, whatever emotion he feels needs to be created. So if you have not actually listened to this song, go do it. He's considered a balladeer, but a ballad is really just a rhyme scheme. Now, with that said, yes, he did win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2017. He did not think he deserved it. He tried to not accept it, but there were a few hiccups with that. If he turned it down and they gave it to someone else, I mean, what is that going to do? Okay, here's your Nobel Prize. You won second place. That's not really a good message to send to more people, especially those great literary names that he had been nominated beside. But that's why he didn't believe he deserved it. He did eventually go, well, he sent one of his people to accept it. And that was that. But Tangled Up in Blue specifically, and a few of his other songs, they've been taught in literary courses for decades. In some classes and with some understandings, and at some universities, there are entire literature classes on Bob Dylan. Okay? Now, let's just get into Tangled Up in Blue so that we don't have too much time going with this. Okay, so early one morning, the sun was shining. I was laying in bed, wondering if she changed at all, if her hair was still red. Okay, so it's an A-B-A-B rhyme scheme. Okay, so he's laying there in bed. He's wondering about some woman in his past, who we don't know yet. But we do know she had red hair. Her folks, they said, our lives together sure was going to be rough. They never did like Mama's homemade dress. Papa's bank book wasn't big enough. Okay, so her parents, staunchly against, or at least not supportive of their relationship, said their lives were going to be difficult together. Her parents never liked basically the social standing of him and his family, meaning his mother making homemade dresses, the bridal dress in this instance, and his father not being that wealthy. So then we have what is ultimately the refrain, or what's the chorus when you're listening to the song. And I was standing on the side of the road, rain falling on my shoes, heading out for the East Coast. Lord knows I've paid some dues getting through. Tangled up in blue. Okay, so we know that at some point with this woman, he was standing on the side of the road and it was raining and he was going east. And by saying, Lord knows I've paid some dues getting through. When you pay your dues, that means you've gone through something difficult in order to garner or learn the lesson. Now, the refrain, the last line, tangled up in blue, you have to deal with the spectrum of what blue is. You can't necessarily, for every single one of these stanzas, apply a singular blue. The full spectrum of blue goes from like sky blue, baby blue to cobalt, midnight blue, and all of these blues evoke different emotions. The idea with blue in general is that it's supposed to evoke some type of sadness, or it's supposed to represent some type of sadness. However, if you paint something sky blue or baby blue, that doesn't necessarily imply a sadness. But the darker blue you get, it seems to be the more daunting and the more saddening blue. So with each time this is brought up, you have to wonder which color is associated with this. We have no idea which blue at all with this first one. We don't know. But as we move on to the second stanza, she was married when we first met, soon to be divorced. I helped her out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little too much force. Okay. So when he first met this woman, she was married and she was basically about to get divorced. So it sounds like the two of them entered into a relationship right off the back of the end of her marriage. And then he says, I helped her out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little too much force. Okay, so you have to ask why, what, how, all of this. If he's helping her out of the jam, especially when he was young, women, and especially divorced women, they would have to have another man either waiting for them or very, very soon thereafter, so that they were not seen or understood to be basically a harlot or like a used woman. Okay, so this will make more sense as we move along in the class, but this is when women, like, we had just gotten the right to vote. Women had just gone out into the workforce. It was still an uncommon sight. And the idea had been to rely on a man or a marriage. So her getting divorced highlighted that there were a few issues. Now he says, but I used a little too much force. I mean, that sounds like it could be very ominous. But the other issue involved here is, I mean, everything that's added up at this point, it doesn't sound like he's the one to force much. So you have to wonder what he forced, how he forced. Did he force there to be a relationship present? Did he force there to be like a marriage in that moment? Did he force, when he asked, did he force her hand into marriage? Necessarily, the second you get out of a divorce, the second you get out of a marriage with a divorce, who, how, and what you're going to marry next is not usually the first thing in your mind. So it may have been that he wanted to marry her. She couldn't necessarily turn him down in that moment, especially because of the timing. But she also probably didn't know it was, or probably knew it just wasn't going to last that long. We drove that car as fast as we could, abandoned it out west. Okay, so this is the opposite direction of where he's going when he's going east in that first stanza. Abandoned out west, split up on a dark, sad night, both agreeing it was best. So they were driving. It sounds like it may have been their honeymoon, but their relationship did not last that long. They drove out west and they abandoned their car. Likely something went, like, in the engine went wrong, but they abandoned it on the side of the road. They broke up because they both agreed that breaking up was best. I mean, often you're not going to actually have a completely equal understanding of how and why when a relationship ends. She turned around to look at me as I was walking away. I heard her say over my shoulder, "We'll meet again someday on the avenue, tangled up in blue." Okay. He sounds more angry in this moment. But is he the one that turns and does a double take? Mm-mm. He keeps walking angry. But she's turned, looked at him again, and is essentially saying, the timing wasn't right for this. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to be together eventually. She says, we'll meet again someday on the avenue. So now we have to ask, what kind of blue? What blue is this narrator tangled up in? I had a job in the Great North Woods working as a cook for a spell, but I never did like it all that much, and one day the axe just fell. Okay, so the Great North Woods, that's the Pacific Northwest. He was working out there as a cook. It wasn't his favorite job. And then you have a double use with the word axe. So one day the axe just fell. That's him getting fired, but also the utility of the axe in the Great North Woods, which is where most of the lumber comes from. So lumberjack, all that funness. So I drifted down to New Orleans. So drifted, it's not only like in an aimless manner describing his journey there. A drifter literally is another name for someone trying to hitch a ride. Where I was looking for to be employed, working for a while on a fishing boat right outside of Delacroix. Okay, so he was a fisherman down in New Orleans, but all the while I was alone. The past was close behind. I seen a lot of women, but she never escaped my mind, and I just grew, tangled up in blue. Okay, so he's working as a fisherman. He says point blank that he's dated a lot of women. He's seen them He's been with a lot of women. But he also says point blank that his past is essentially constantly on his mind. That bodes ill for like any other relationship he ever enters into as working out well. But I mean, we'll see how it works. She never escaped my mind, and I just grew tangled up in blue. So if she never escapes her mind, all of these new women, they're being compared to her. So they don't last. She was working in a topless place, and I stopped in for a beer. I just kept looking at the side of her face in the spotlight, so clear. Now, here we still have the utility of she, but we have to wonder, we have to ask, is this the same she? Let's read a little bit more. And later on, the crowd thinned out. I was just about to do the same. She was standing there in the back of my chair, said to me, "Don't I know your name?" I muttered something under my breath. She studied the lines on my face. I must admit I felt a little uneasy when she bent down to tie the laces of my shoe, tangled up in blue. Okay. Now, there are two different ways that you can take this. She's a stripper, and he had gone in just to try and get drunk, to try and forget about the redheaded woman. But at closing time, she comes up and says, "Don't I know you?" basically to him. He muttered, so he's trying to avoid saying something. And then it's, "I must admit I felt a little uneasy when she bent down to tie the laces of my shoe." Okay, so here we have the issue of, if we go the route of it's the same woman, then yes, she knows his name. She should remember it, all of the above. So why would she say, "Don't I know your name?" And is he muttering because he's still in kind of an awkward position with her? Because remember, he was the one that was more angry, who was more volatile at the end of their relationship. Now, if you take it as this is not the same woman, that's when you have to look at, why is the same word being used for both? Why not assign a name to at least one of the women, so that there's less confusion? Now, because we have her working in a topless place, it's not just an issue of she's a stripper. It's an issue that he knows this woman, he cares about this woman, so forth and so on. Is she acting like an ex, or even like an object of sexuality, when she ties his shoelaces? No. That is something intensely maternal there. And as we move on in the next stanza, like she basically watches over this guy, okay? So it could be the same person. It might not be the same person. But depending on your interpretation of who the she is from the strip club, it's going to determine how you take when she bent down to tie the laces of my shoe. Because one way, it's extremely maternal. Another way, it's extremely sexual. And you can make both arguments for either it's the same woman or not the same. Now, next stanza, she lit a burner on the stove. I'm going to go the route of this is a different woman, okay? She lit a burner on the stove and offered me a pipe. I thought you'd never say hello, she said. You look like the silent type. Okay, so now here's the issue that we encounter with these first four lines of the stanza. So it's like it's a pipe of weed or something along those lines. It's some type of drug. But she says, I thought you'd never say hello. That could be the ex. You look like the silent type. The ex isn't going to say you look like the silent type to her ex-husband. She's not. It's just not how it works. However, that first line sounds like something an ex would say after years, who's the one that isn't still harboring ill feeling, saying, I thought you would never say hello, or I thought you wouldn't say hello. So again, we have this back and forth issue of, is this the same woman or not? Then she opened up a book of poems and handed it to me, written by an Italian poet from the 13th century. And every one of them words rang true rang true and glowed like burning coal, pouring off every page like it was written from my soul, from me to you, tangled up in blue. Okay, so now we have a little bit of an answer, but it also makes things more complicated. We have a you. This you is this woman that has never left the back of his mind. So is the she a different she, and the you that first she from the first few stanzas, or are they all the same? Or are they the same physical person, but different people just based on time? Now, she opened up a book of love poetry. That's what it is. It's Petrarchan sonnets. It's Italian sonnets. And we know this because the 13th century, 1200s, that's when Petrarch lived. Petrarchan sonnets, they are notorious for being for their theme of pick an author, any author that writes in that form, writing love poetry in that form. But he also says every one of the words rang true, like it was written in my soul from me to you. So who's the you and who's she? I lived with them on Montague Street. Okay, who's the them? We are now encountering another pronoun. Them, we don't know who them is. We lived with them on Montague Street. I lived with them on Montague Street. In a basement down the stairs, there was music in the cafes at night and revolution in the air. Okay, remember, this is 60s, 70s. Okay, so social revolution, civil rights, sexual freedom, Korean War ending, Vietnam starting, huge protests against Vietnam. That's revolution in the air. But we still don't know who the them is. Then he started into dealing with slaves, and something inside of him died, and she had to sell everything she owned and froze up inside. Who's he? It has to be a part of the them that he lived with, but what's going on here? Who's into dealing with slaves in New Orleans in the 1960s and 70s. Now, what this is actually about is it's the woman from the strip club, whether you want to say it's the same woman or not, it's her boyfriend. In the 60s and 70s, New Orleans was basically the port of call for sex slavery and human trafficking. So then he started into dealing with slaves. And then some part of him died, and she had to sell everything she owned and froze up inside. So part of her is seizing up and dying as well. And when the bottom finally fell out, I became withdrawn. The only thing I knew how to do was keep on keeping on like a bird that flew, tangled up in blue. So he just kind of kept rambling along, drifting along. So now I'm going back. I got to get to her somehow. Ask yourself, which her? All the people we used to know, they're an illusion to me now. Some are mathematicians, some are carpenters' wives. Don't know how it all got started. I don't know what they're doing with their lives. Okay, so here we have to address some of the Judeo-Christian allegory that is sneaking in here. Okay? Because you can't separate the X from random stripper, and the same name, she, is being used for the X and random stripper, and for the maternal and the highly sexualized image of the stripper, because they have the same name. You have to sit here and you have to go, how do I make sense out of that? Basically, she tries to save him by giving him a place to live, by giving him a place to call home. Now he's saying, I got to get to her somehow. Who's this her? Is it his ex, or is it the stripper, or are they the same person? What? But then you have the mention of the oppositional binary of mathematicians and carpenters' wives. Okay? Now, carpenters' wives is important because that's Christian allegory. The most famous carpenter. Known in pick any religion, it's still going to be the same. And however you want to deal with that mythology, it's still going to be the same. Christ is mentioned and referenced to as a carpenter. Now, why does that tie in? Ties in because Christ's mother was named Mary. And there are also references to the fact that he may have had a romantic and or sexual relationship with Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is a different person, but she joined Christ and the apostles when she was forgiven for being a prostitute by Christ. So they are different people in this allegory. But it sounds like I'm pulling at straws there. But why else mention carpenters' wives? Why not just say some are mathematicians, some are artists' wives? I mean, that that's less heavy in the baggage that the word comes with. But he also says, I don't know what these people are doing anymore. They're all illusions. They don't matter. She's the only one that matters. Don't know how it all got started. I don't know what they're doing with their lives, but me, I'm still on the road, heading for another joint. We always did feel the same. We just saw it from a different point of view. Tangled up in blue. So here we have this narrator finally coming to a realization that he and his ex always did feel the same. They just looked at it from different perspectives. And sometimes perspective is crucial. And if he's come to a realization, and kind of had an epiphany, then basically that means he has a new point of view. It might be hers. And he just keeps, he says, I got to get to her somehow. So then you have to sit there, and at the end of this one, you have to ask, which blue? He's still tangled up in blue, but which blue? Is it a happy, playful blue? Is it a hopeful blue? Is it a terrified, hopeless blue? Is it seafoam teal blue that's kind of whimsical and manic pixie dream girlish? What kind of blue? There are different emotions inherently tied to each one of these stanzas. And through that, and how you view who the people in this are, that's the different blues. Okay, guys. Homework, pick your favorite piece. Pick your favorite piece for your first essay. I am going to do an essay overview, like what you need to do. I'm also going to type it, and I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to go through it point by point. So if something's good, point it out. If something's bad in the example, point it out. That's going to be the next video, okay? You just have to pick the piece that you think you can do the most with that we've read for this class thus far. Okay. I'll see you guys soon. Keep safe, keep healthy, and you guys know, email me or text me if you have questions. All right. Talk to you later.